All right. A very warm welcome to all the attendees, to all the panelist member, for another great session of academic radiology education program. I'm Dr. Janardana Ponatapura, JP. I'm one of the cardiothoracic radiologists from Wake Forest Baptist University School of Medicine in North Carolina. Very brief about what we do as AREP, the Global AREP, which is a nonprofit initiative, and we are aimed at providing high-quality radiology education to colleagues worldwide. This was established in October 2021 and is based at the Department of Radiology at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. And we offer free online educational resources and live webinars featuring academic radiologists from leading US institutions. This program is designed to bridge education gaps, particularly for radiologists in resource-limited settings, by sharing expertise and fostering global collaboration. So we host bi-monthly webinars from January to October covering various radiology subspecialties. The sessions are well attended with up to 700 participants per live events and include contributions from esteemed institutions. So our reach extends to radiologists in different countries in Asia, Africa, and in Middle East. This program's success is driven by dedication of its committees, moderators, and speakers who work tirelessly without external funding. In addition to webinars, we also offer projects like the Radiology Excellency Program, which focus on mentoring and specializing radiology challenges in various countries. So again, today we have a session. Probably this is the most hot topic in radiology right now, and probably the whole session what we have done. Kind of very dynamic. This is AI in radiology. And very befitting, we got this speaker who doesn't need any introduction, Dr. Albert Shao. And Dr. Albert Shao is MD, PhD in cardiothoracic radiologist. He's trained in engineering at Caltech and bioengineering and bioinformatics in University of California, San Diego Medical Scientist Training Program. He further went on to complete his residency and fellowships in intervention radiology and cardiovascular imaging at Stanford before returning to UCSD as faculty in radiology, where he leads advanced radiology, cardiovascular imaging, and the augmented imaging and data analytics research lab. While at radiology resident at Stanford, he co-founded Arteries, which is a cloud-native software company to bring 4D flow MRI and artificial intelligence technologies to market. So he's a pioneer in AI. He continues to partner with industries to develop and create new imaging technologies to improve diagnosis and management of disease. All right, welcome, Dr. Albert, and the stage is yours, sir. Thank you so much for doing this.
Here we go. Are you able to hear me still?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you for the introduction, JP. This is obviously a very important hot topic. I'm hopeful that as I'm surveying through the presentation of the different applications that we've developed, that it'll trigger some good questions from you. I'm happy to answer anything that comes up. My journey through AI is more of one of practicality, what we need in our practice in order to make it more accurate, more reliable for our patients, and make it more efficient. I think that that's a big piece of what AI can do for us, is to make our practice more efficient and accomplish more in less time. So I'll quickly go through a few beginning points on how I got started with AI. I do a lot of work with industry, including active work with through research grant support with many companies. The first part of this will be on 4D flow, which I'm sure many people have not heard of, but it's an important piece of the puzzle, because it's how I got started to create a company that then evolved into an AI company over the last, I think that was about 10 years ago that we started, maybe 12 years ago. Um, uh, from the very beginning of my experience with AI, I began to realize that there are a couple different areas throughout the imaging pipeline that we can leverage it, both from the side of the scanner, including the side of the scanner at the level of acquisition or image reconstruction. So that's on CT or MRI, how we acquire the images. And you're starting to see many of those applications now become product from the different vendors. Oops, let me go forward. To the data center where you're storing the images. You can perform computational analyses that don't require a human involved in the analysis, link up images, register them, find the cardiac function, that kind of stuff. It can occur at the data center with no human intervention. And then at the workstation, when you're interpreting the images, user interactive analyses can benefit from AI, including 3D visualization, or finally the reporting or interpretive tasks that we do, identifying pneumonia, for example, on a chest X-ray. All right, so I'll go over all these different levels and what we've done in our own lab in the different areas. So to give you a sense of what is possible, obviously there's a lot of work in many companies across the world to incorporate AI into their products. What's been our focus? Well, I trained in cardiovascular imaging. Of course, I also trained in intervention. But in cardiovascular imaging, the biggest piece of the puzzle is, for MRI anyway, is getting good quality images. It's not so easy. It's actually quite technically difficult because we have to deal with both breathing motion and heart motion in the chest, and we want to characterize the heart motion. What I started with, was a combination of techniques, 3D Cine and 4D Flow, that would allow us to move from a 2D world to a 3D world or 4D world, so that we can manage or diagnose different defects in congenital heart disease, both adults and children, because even after surgery, we monitor those patients with imaging. I realized fairly quickly that that wasn't going to be enough as a contribution to the field. So as AI was emerging, we developed a series of different algorithms for localization to help us to prescribe imaging planes, and I'll go through some of that in more detail, as well as simplify the post-processing analysis of cardiac MRI. That became a product from the company I started, Arteris, as well as many other companies that were competing and are still competing for market in the post-processing world of cardiac MRI. So what was the really primary problem? Well, for cardiac MRI, you'll find, of course, that it doesn't exist at most institutions in the US and most institutions around the world, largely because we have to train specialized technologists repeatedly at each institution over a 1 to 2 year period, and it does take a lot of physician supervision. So that's a lot of work, typically uncompensated work. We just volunteer to do that, so that we can provide that to our patients at different institutions. It involves, what makes it difficult is it involves creating double oblique imaging planes through the heart, identifying special parameters like the inversion time so that we can see scar, and then especially for congenital heart disease, lining up imaging planes to analyze blood flow in different structures of the heart, or in the big vessels of the chest. So this is one example of what we've done to automate the acquisition of double oblique imaging planes. What one of my first grad students did was to use what's called the heat map localization, a strategy, a deep learning strategy to be able to identify different structures like the apex and the mitral valve. And we showed that if we could do this reasonably well, that we could automate the prescription of imaging planes that we typically try to acquire on during the scan. And we did this both on these long axis images as well as short axis images, identifying the different landmarks that we use for defining the double oblique imaging planes to show that we could do this with deep learning. This was back in 2018, 2019. We That wouldn't be enough if we just stopped there. Then hey, problem solved, right? No, I think you have to take that technology and implement it on the scanner, show that it actually could how that could translate into a clinical product. So we piloted out our algorithms on the scanner, and we have these algorithms actually running currently on our scanner again, so that our technologists can use this to automate their scan prescription. And for technologists that aren't trained in cardiac MRI, it can help them considerably. So this is a video from one of the first tests of that software many years ago. Another key part of cardiac MRI is nulling the myocardium. This is something that you may be familiar with for flare or other sequences in the brain where we're trying to suppress some signal. Now, in this case, we're suppressing the myocardium, and unfortunately, that's something that's not a static inversion time, but changes both for different patients as well as over time for the same patient as the contrast changes. So what we did was we've developed a neural network to be able to identify that inversion time, and showed that this new architecture was able to do better than some of the traditional architectures. We've done more since then to make this a lighter weight neural network that runs even faster computationally with less resources. So these are things that can evolve and change over time. Even the architectures that we use and the performance can increase and improve over time. Also, on the acquisition side of things, one of the challenges with cardiac MRI is that we have to image relatively quickly in order to match the speed of motion of the heart and avoid a motion artifact from breathing in patients, especially who aren't able to breath hold. So one of the techniques that we came up with was the super resolution technique, to take a low resolution image and enhance the detail in a particular area around the heart. This super resolution technique uses neural networks to basically overcome undersampling. But in any case, you can see that in this one example, the area that's inside the blue box has this super resolution enhancement that's been employed on it. So that was a paper back in 2020 that we implemented, and I think at least one other vendor, one of the MRI vendors has implemented a product that's similar to this. Others have implemented in Fourier space in the image reconstruction pipeline. Now, the last little bit of trying to improve cardiac MRI, make it more scalable, is 4D flow. So I'll talk about this just because I think it's an interesting technology. It is what I started my career building as a resident. It's software for analyzing this data, allowing us to navigate the 4D volume in real time so that we can measure specific vessels. This is the original product that Arter's created years ago, or actually my prototype that then Arter's then developed into a product. And you can see that it's quite capable of visualizing things like tricuspid regurgitation or pulmonary regurgitation, and allow us to quantify the amount of blood flow that's coming back. That's the extra effort, the extra volume load that the heart has to squeeze against when the valves are incompetent. This is just an example of where we can ways that we can confirm that the measurements of blood flow are accurate. In this case, this is a patient with patent ductus arteriosus, and we can measure that jet directly. We can see that that is very close to the difference between the aortic arch and the descending thoracic aorta. That's about 1.3 liters per minute. It's also the same or roughly the same as the difference between the increase in flow between the main pulmonary artery and the branch pulmonary arteries is about 5.6, 4.3. So it's 1.3 difference. And that's the amount of blood that's coming from this part of the aorta into the pulmonary artery. And the 5.6 liters a minute that's going out the pulmonary arteries is also coming up the ascending aorta about 5.7 liters per minute. So there's always a little bit of error in any measurement that you do. But this is a nice example of the concept of flow continuity or conservation of mass that we have from our technology. Building the technology, of course, isn't enough. You have to do a number of things to prove that it works well in different contexts, like pediatric congenital heart disease, or when I came down to San Diego, adult congenital heart disease, or structural heart disease, looking at specific valves that are developed stenosis over time, or extra cardiac applications like what we've focused on here as an opportunity is neurovascular arteriovenous malformations and in pelvic congestion, pelvic venous disease. And that's actually quite a wide application of ours for 4D flow here in San Diego. Now I'm going to move towards deep learning. So how we've now transitioned from using 4D flow for the purpose of diagnostic interpretation, but now to seed the development of new deep learning algorithms, AI algorithms that tell us more about the function of the heart. So this is a technique that we developed a couple of years ago using some of our 4D flow data. And just as a reflection, what do we use 4D flow for? 4D flow is, again, used to evaluate structural heart disease or congenital heart disease. This is a patient with subaortic stenosis and bicuspid aortic valve, which you can see flow acceleration even below the level of valve. So that's how we know there's subaortic stenosis. We also see that in patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, for example, and here a patient with HCM and mitral regurgitation from SAM, systolic anterior motion of the mitral valve. You can see flow acceleration in late systole from here. Anyway, so taking this kind of data, we asked the question, is it possible that we could train a deep learning algorithm to measure the myocardial motion itself? This is an analogy as if you had a video of a freeway and you wanted to measure the velocity of all the cars on the freeway, you could do that. You can estimate the velocity of the cars on the freeway. In a similar way, we're trying to measure the velocities of the muscle. Now, you just need good training data. So it turns out the 4D flow data is very noisy, but it is giving you the right behavior. So we asked, can we train such a deep learning algorithm? And that's what we did. We took our source SSFP images, asked, can we from that measure a variable, a particular quantity of radial strain? And to get there, we trained a neural network to look at the SSFP images that we always routinely acquire for the last probably 50 years of cardiac MRI. This is what we've been able to acquire, and then take that image data and then measure the myocardial motion. And from that, you just use physics to calculate things like strain rate and strain. And you can then break it into myocardial segments and measure those quantities and show their strain curves as well. So this is something that we were able to do, and I'll just show you a couple of cases of that. The main reason for this is that when we look at strain algorithms or strain software from a lot of the commercial vendors, I found that the software that we were looking at never seemed to correlate with what we visually could see as wall motion abnormalities. So it was my feeling that we needed to develop something better, and that it was possible that this new 4D flow technique or approach to measuring strain would be more reliable. So we took roughly 30 patients with ischemic heart disease, which we knew would likely have a large fraction have wall motion abnormalities. And then this is essentially what we found in all the patients, is that the territories that had reduced strain measured by our algorithm also were the same patients and same territories that had related myocardial scar wall motion abnormality, and often perfusion defects as well. So this is a one characteristic example of that population that we used to prove that this algorithm actually worked, which is also quite different than most what people call feature tracking algorithms. This is a deep learning strategy that seems to be superior to the traditional feature tracking approaches. Anyway, it also allows us to do things like measure myocardial dyssynchrony, something that's very difficult to do, looking at the entire cardiac cycle, which parts of the myocardium are contracting at different times. So when that happens, obviously the whole function of the heart is not very good, but it's an important piece because it can also tell us where in the myocardium we should be trying to ablate, where ventricular ectopy is coming from. So it can help guide our cardiologists, electrophysiologists to the right therapies in the right location, shorten their treatment procedural time. This is just a characteristic example of a bundle branch block, just as many people have probably recognized this even without the strain algorithm, just to show that it is possible for us to visualize the dysynchrony that we see in this patient population, and quite reliably as well. I think that publication is something we've been working on for a while. All right, so we're 20 minutes. I'm going to move on to a couple different areas that might be more familiar to a radiologist that aren't, highly specialized in cardiac imaging. Two big areas that we see a lot in routine chest imaging. A lot of these are in the computational analysis side of the equation, not so much user interactive, because I think most radiologists don't do a lot of 3D post-processing, unlike cardiac imaging, where we do a lot of that every day. It's an essential part of our practice, but for most practices, neuroimaging, abdominal imaging, chest imaging, people aren't so comfortable doing a lot of 3D analysis. So a lot of that has to happen without any human intervention. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Years ago, we started to work with this COPD population because there's a large US clinical trial or US trial of about 10,000 patients where they followed patients with suspected COPD, lots of smoking. And we took that patient population and trained a deep learning algorithm to measure the different components, the different lobes of the lung, and then especially to measure the amount of air trapping that we could, that was basically the difference between inspiratory and expiratory phase. So in patients who have air trapping, the attenuation of the lungs doesn't change much between inspiration and expiration. And so you can use that to quantify the severity of air trapping. And then there are certainly patients who have a ton of emphysema as well. So we wanted to be able to quantify that automatically. Using a deep learning algorithm, it's possible to do that, which provides us a lot of data for these patients, whether or not they meet criteria for COPD. So we wanted to define the criteria for that. And what's nice about this population of patients is that they all have spirometry or pulmonary function testing, and we can then correlate what we see on that physiologic testing with what we observe in air trapping and emphysema. So in this example, we see that across these patients with severe emphysema and or air trapping, they all have COPD. And we could then also prognosticate, meaning if we have the exam at time 0, in 5 years, do they have a decline in FEV1 by 500 milliliters, for example? Then we can predict, well, if you have a severe air trapping or emphysema in these ranges, then there was a 2.5 to 3-fold increased risk of progression. Now, you can also do the same with spirometry. You can see that patients who have Gold 2 level disease also have like a 2.5-fold increased risk of progression in 5 years. Those who are already Gold 4 or Gold 3, they don't progress because they're already they're at the end stage. They don't progress as much, especially Gold 4. There's nowhere to go. But but the patients with gold 2 and 3 can progress with a twofold likelihood. But what's important is that if you take the combination of CT, quantitative CT measurements, and pulmonary function testing, you can see that the progression of disease is very rapid amongst those patients who have gold 2 disease on pulmonary function testing and severe air trapping or emphysema. So that's another important work that we've been doing to show that quantitative CT can provide us a lot of prognostic data, and it's worth doing. In recent years, CT has now become part of the diagnostic criteria for COPD. That's something that's changed from when I was a resident. I was told you don't diagnose COPD from CT, but now that's quite different. It's changed where CT is one of the core criteria that's weighted equally with pulmonary function testing. Now, what's another application of this technology? Turns out we do look at air trapping for a number of other disease scenarios as well, specifically looking for bronchiolitis obliterans. This can occur in patients with stem cell transplant or lung transplant due to injury of the small airways by the immune system in both cases. This is an example of a patient who was initially read as negative, no air trapping. And I can understand why. If you're looking at the images, they look normal. There's nothing qualitatively different about it. There's no mosaic attenuation. It just looks uniform. But the problem is when you have diffuse disease like this, it's everywhere. So you can't rely on mosaic attenuation as your visual assessment. You need to measure. And the nice thing about having an AI algorithm is it can measure everywhere where you wouldn't have time to draw ROIs everywhere. Anyway, so this was a patient who had severe air trapping, about 3/4 of the lungs. The imaging was diagnostic. There's an expiratory phase with an actual expiration with a concavity of the posterior membranous portion of the trachea. And there was a big volume change between inspiration and expiration. So we know it's a good quality scan. But then there's severe air trapping. This is one which didn't use this pipeline, but we now have this pipeline available to give us the quantitative data. Anyway, so this patient, though it was read initially as negative, had extensive pneumomediastinum 2 months later from severe bronchiolitis obliterans and was hospitalized for quite a while on steroids to try to reduce the immune response from graft versus host disease that this patient developed, which was a cause of bronchiolitis obliterans. Anyway, so what we did as an experiment was to just see what people thought about this algorithm after that index case, and had multiple readers look at inspiratory and expiratory CT, just grade qualitatively like they were used to, do a semi-quantitative assessment of the severity of air trapping with different ROI measurements, and then at each stage make an assessment of whether they thought there was air trapping in each lobe. And then when provided this quantitative data, see how much they thought it impacted their interpretation. So we did a survey of each of the readers of whether they agreed with the AI algorithm, what they thought they agreed, because we actually had the data, but this was more of a survey, whether they thought the AI had a impact on their final assessment or whether they thought the AI algorithm was useful. It turns out that readers were kind of all over the place. They had kind of moderate sense of agreement. Some thought they agreed with the algorithm modestly on average. They thought there was little change of the algorithm on their final assessment. And they thought maybe it was useful, maybe not, above neutral. Some people thought it was not useful. Other people thought it was very useful. So that's quite a range of opinions. But what's interesting is their opinions were very discordant with what actually happened. If you look at the qualitative assessment, their reader agreement was only 0.28. As you incorporated more quantitative data, either by asking everyone to draw an ROI or using the AI algorithm that actually did the full quantification, you see that the inter-reader agreement actually improved considerably from 0.28 to 0.84. Imagine if you're a patient and you get reader A gives you one answer, reader C gives you another answer. That was largely what was happening with a qualitative assessment. But with a quantitative assessment, then you get the same answer from different readers. I think that that's a really powerful indication of our where our sort of radiologists' perception or self-perception of our need for AI is very discordant from the actual reality and what benefit it could actually provide in the consistency of the service that we provide. So these were four very experienced radiologists, not residents. They were actually faculty that all had very different opinions on how they should read those exams. Quite interesting. Now, not just objectively did they improve their consistency, but they also improved their correlation with functional obstruction, this FEV1 FVC ratio. So as they used the quantitative data in their assessment, they got better agreement. Interestingly, without any human, the AI algorithm, the data correlated even better. So that's important too, is there is a need for radiologists, but not for all things. In quantification, maybe you're better off with just the AI, but you do need the humans to look at the images because there are circumstances that the AI is not sort of designed to handle. It's kind of like an autopilot of a car. You wouldn't just run it autopilot without a human. You do need the human for some things. Anyway, so what about X-rays? X-rays are the most common exam that we do. They're very fast, very cheap, accessible, large numbers. They're all over the place in terms of quality, even in the US. It takes a lot of effort to maintain quality over thousands and thousands of exams, of course. And we use them for many reasons. You'll see referrals in all contexts, in the emergency room, to the outpatient setting, to inpatients, whatever. Any number of reasons to order an X-ray for lines and tubes, whatever. So we've developed a number of different algorithms. Some of these different companies have made similar algorithms and brought them to product. This was an early one by one of my research residents, now fellow, Brian Hurt, who was able to create an algorithm to identify the location of endotracheal tubes and their relationship with the central airways. This is another work by one of my computer science master students, who's now an MD PhD student in Illinois, I think, along with my project scientist, Samira, who developed an algorithm to infer the serum NT-proBNP from X-ray to give us a sense of whether or not patients had pulmonary edema related to heart failure. And this was a pretty helpful algorithm in being able to infer that number from the X-ray, something that is very difficult for radiologists to do. This is a few images from that study showing that at different resolutions, the algorithm started to focus more on the lungs. So it really told us that when you're using low resolution images, it's not really using the lungs to figure out where what the NT-proBNP was. The overall performance also increased with higher resolution images, as you would expect, because we do rely on small details like the curly bee lines at high resolution that get lost at low resolution. So it's really important. Now, we also showed that different readers are different in their capability of inferring NT-proBNP or assessing pulmonary edema. And this is an important reference point, because I think if you tried to train this algorithm with readers, you would have a difficult time figuring out which readers were good and which ones were not. So you always need, to some degree, especially for a complex task like this, some reference standard that's stronger. And for us, the NT-proBNP is the best reference standard for this kind of a problem. It may be better than a human, because that's actually how I learned how to assess pulmonary edema. Is actually I train myself looking at NT-proBNP and BNP that sometimes the physicians order. All right. Well, what about pneumonia? Right before COVID, probably about 2018, 2019, was when I had Brian first come into the lab as a postdoc. He was doing a surgery internship at the time and then was interested in radiology and wanted to see what he could do to develop AI algorithms. So brought him into the lab and we focused on this problem of diagnosing pneumonia, which is commonly missed actually in our practice, in every practice probably, because it can be subtle. Not in this case. This is one that's quite obvious. The right heart border is missing, and you see all this airspace opacity. This is one that everyone would correctly diagnose. But there are cases where it's not that easy, and we saw that early in COVID with the subtle airspace opacity, so the viral pneumonia that not everyone was immediately familiar with, but we all are now. Anyway, so we developed this algorithm and wanted to develop it in a way that could highlight where the abnormality was so that it could give a visual cue. You can see that this is kind of similar to the way that we visualize 40 flow and everything. So it's it's just the way that I think of the world, I guess. Anyway, so I wanted to highlight the areas with the color map, and that's what he ultimately was able to develop. And we showed that this performed quite well as a strategy of localizing pneumonia. And what's nice about it is that we developed this algorithm pre-COVID, but when COVID happened, we could immediately apply it. So that was sort of the development of the algorithm. Anyway, from when COVID first came to us, this was one of the first publications in New England Journal, and I told Brian, hey, why don't you download those images from these first reports of COVID and see if your algorithm actually works on those images. And it turned out it did, which was quite shocking because it can be really subtle to, especially these days when people weren't used to looking for viral pneumonia. It can be really subtle where the pneumonia is. If you have a chance to look at the images, you can go back to that original New England Journal paper or our paper. We just showed that this algorithm, just out of the box, the algorithm we developed worked quite well. And then, of course, patients with florid pneumonia, it was able to highlight those as well. So we applied this into our practice. We were able to deploy this on an Amazon Web Services server that was essentially resourced by Amazon to us. And this was one of the first cases where we had this running, but it was before our radiologist at night knew what it was. So they just marked this area as abnormal, but you can see actually the right middle lobe is also affected. The right heart border is missing. So they kind of just missed that part of the pneumonia. They saw the asymmetry between the upper lobes. So they got that part right. But there was actually bilateral pneumonia that the algorithm was able to pick up. And 2 days later, you can see, you don't have to take my word for it. You can see 2 days later, both of those areas bloomed considerably because of the severity of the viral pneumonia. In the early days of the pandemic, of course, no one was immune. So there was no vaccine. So patients got really sick. Anyway, I wasn't too happy with the algorithm itself. I thought it was okay, but it wasn't capturing the whole thing, all the pneumonia. So if we wanted to quantify the severity of pneumonia, I like quantification, and we needed to do something to enhance the algorithm. So we had this system that essentially captures images and allows us to deploy algorithms, but we also needed in a way for our AI developers, our lab to pull that data and update the algorithm. So we were able to do that and capture the feedback of radiologists through image annotation. So this is the initial algorithm. What we did was we painted, I think, about 1,500 X-rays in patients who had both a CT and an X-ray, and only a tiny fraction had COVID. It was only like 5% maybe. But just training the algorithm to pick up the areas of abnormality we saw on CT, we were able to enhance the performance of this algorithm quite a bit. So in that same patient that you saw, this was the initial algorithm, the initial CNN convolutional neural network, and we were able to enhance the performance a lot, and then use it to quantify the severity of pneumonia. And then we also were able to enhance its ability to perform well on our UCSD population. So that was a second benefit. The previous algorithm was just using public data that was released with the RSNA pneumonia challenge that the STR was involved in years ago. Anyway, so another postdoc of mine, Amy, then took that data and looked at a couple different outcome measures, what happens with mortality or whether they were likely to be intubated or hospitalized for a long duration. And so she did these analyses. This is using radiologist scoring, which we don't never do because it would take too long. But this is one way to quantify the severity of pneumonia. A modified RAL score. But we essentially took that and we correlated it with the fractional area here. You can see that modified RAL score correlates well with fractional area. But the fractional area, that's an automated measurement, also did a reasonable job at predicting these outcomes of whether the patients died or were intubated or were hospitalized for a long time. You can see the performance of the AI algorithm, this fractional area measurement, was not as good as a human, but it was automated, so you wouldn't need to have a human do it, which is something we never do clinically anyway. So it still performs quite well and predicts the severity of the likelihood of mortality, intubation, and long hospital duration. Anyway, so hopefully that gives you a preview of what will come in the future for lots of areas of radiology from the standpoint of being able to diagnose at the workstation with some advanced things with 4D flow for quantifying or prognostication of patients with COPD or bronchiolitis obliterans, or even simple things like diagnosing pneumonia or pulmonary edema on X-ray. Actually, not that simple. We do it wrong all the time, but very commonly. So anyway, hopefully that helps and gives you some insights into what's coming for us in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Albert. That's excellent. I mean, you just went through like how your journey started and what kind of inspired you to do these things. It's great, and also touched upon the different modalities and how the AI is going to be affecting us in the future. Thank you so much for such a wonderful lecture.
Yeah, of course. Any questions for me, of course?
Yeah. I mean, I have. I'm just looking at the Q&A box. Yeah, for the attendees, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to type that in the Q&A box, and Dr. Albert will answer them. So I had a quick question. So with so many AI vendors, there are like a million vendors on AI, and every day there are new vendors who's approaching us about this. Is there a FDA or some regulatory board created for this, or is there a plan to create any regulatory boards for this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big, a current and ongoing problem because at many levels, uh, the issue is, we're still very early in the maturity of a lot of the algorithms. So most of the products that you're seeing that are passing through the FDA are what we call triage products, where they just basically say, well, you should read this one before that one, because this one's likely to have pneumonia, this one less so. And part of the reason is the bar for getting a product through a triage is very low, and they can already start to sell that commercially or clinically and get FDA, which you need FDA clearance for. I think that's not the end goal, I hope, just saying which X-ray you should read first. I think all these algorithms that you've seen from our lab are well beyond the triage, but require a fair amount of investment to bring to FDA, for example, if you wanted to sell them. The big problem, though, is that there's just no financially. There's not much of a market in terms of what the companies could generate in revenue from the hospital. The hospitals are going to be very slow to create budgets for AI, right? As you can imagine, they have a hard, especially right now, they have a hard time just recruiting enough radiologists, right? And so if you were to choose between two things, do you have enough radiologists or you have enough AI algorithms? I think you're going to lean towards making sure that you can compete for the physicians, and the AI will take a back seat to that. Now, if you had, if it became an issue of you couldn't hire any radiologists because you didn't have the AI infrastructure and software, then that's when that would play in. And so I think in the US, a lot of the financial sort of circumstances really color the way that AI can get adopted or not get adopted. So I think right now, I think you're still seeing very immature products coming
Hmm.
out from most of the companies that don't actually work very well because they're really looking to try to just build this market presence and try to do that. And they're not really producing really useful algorithms, in my opinion, currently. Yeah.
Yeah, no, no, thank you so much. So we have a question by Dr. Tyree. It says, is there any program that international residents can learn AI online?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what you mean by that. On one hand, you see that a lot of the stuff that we do is very technical, right? And so that's one kind of education of AI is like how do you build an AI algorithm? And that certainly takes a lot of computing skill and formal training in something engineering or computer science related. Um, on the other hand, there's a question of I think most radiologists would want to know is um, how do I use the algorithms or use the software? And to some degree, that's really dependent on how they implement that software, right? Like there are companies that provide you a software and then just flag the case for you to read. There's not much education that's required, right? Like all you need to know is to click on a button like you're clicking on an email. And I think that that's you just get the results of what their algorithm is telling you. Now, the bigger, more important question is one of scientific training, right? If somebody tells you that my software does this, or I'm going to sell you this, I don't know, even if you were to hire someone to build a fence in your backyard or something, you need a way to assess whether or not the algorithm, whether the sales guy is telling you something that's accurate, or or are they making something up, and you need to have the scientific training or the ability to read the scientific literature well enough to say whether or not they're being honest with you. And then being able to you would also want to test it in your own environment and say, does this algorithm actually work? And I think that that's not so much an AI training as much as a scientific training, right? Like to be
Right.
able to tell the truth from fiction is about being able to analyze data and say, it might have worked in this one case or that case, or not worked in this case or that case, but as a whole, you saw ROC curves and that kind of stuff. That's more about scientific training. Do you have the ability to analyze data to prove to yourself and others whether or not this algorithm actually works, right, in our practice? And I think that's a bigger piece of the puzzle. The field of radiology needs to be well trained in being able to interpret data and create data and then create knowledge about the algorithms as they come up because each algorithm will be different.
Thank you. Our next question is by Ken Shah. It says, great talk, appreciate your time. Is there a no-code environment to build AI solutions for radiology?
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Is there
It-
a what?
Is there a no-code environment?
No, oh, no, oh, no code environment, like to be able to build an algorithm without code.
Yeah, yeah, I
Um,
guess so.
Yeah, there are these things that people have tried to build, but even if you were able to build such a thing or use such a thing, you would still have to test it, right? So you would need to collect the hardest part about building AI algorithms is no longer the training. Actually, that's like very easy these days. I have undergraduate students in their freshman year do that in 2 months, right? So that's not the hardest part. The hardest part is actually figuring out what problem you want to address and then collecting the relevant data for that. And that means like marking up the images or whatever the case may be. And so that's the bulk of the effort is developing the right um, problem statement. Half the battle is knowing what problem you're trying to solve. So a no code would only get you a piece of that puzzle. And then at the end of it, once you develop the algorithm, you would still need to test it and ask the question, in which circumstances does that algorithm work? So at the end of the day, you still need to code. There's no code environment
Right.
for scientific exploration these days. Every field of medicine and even biology is becoming computational.
Right. Right. Thank you. So Nat has a question. She says, can you give your opinion about virtual native enhancement for cardiac MRI?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple different strategies for doing things like that, like T1 mapping or using an algorithm that essentially infers the delayed enhancement map off of the SSFP or some other image series. Um, I think the question you always have to ask um, is it feasible with the data that you're providing the algorithm? Is it possible that a T1 map can provide the information that is in myocardial post-contrast myocardial delayed enhancement image? I would say it's probably possible, right? So that's certainly something we see correlation of. Now, if you're asking, can you do, virtual delayed enhancement off of a SSFP image, I would say that's probably just looking at the wall motion and then giving you it if it's using cine or it's looking at thinning of the myocardium. So I think your intuition about images still applies in the AI world. It
Mhm.
can be just merely associative. Meaning like A is associated with B is associated with C, and it's looking at B, it's looking at A to get to C, but it's only going to be predictive like we are. I can look at a cine image and say there's likely scar in that piece of myocardium in the context of ischemic heart disease. And I don't need to see the delayed enhancement image necessarily, but I can predict what the delayed enhancement image looks like. In many ways, that's basically what that algorithm is doing, is learning that inference, that specific thing that we're also doing.
Great. Think, yeah, I had one last question, just for respectful of the time. Uh, I mean, this is $1 million question everyone asks, like, would AI replace radiologists? I mean, just your final thoughts on that. In near future, I mean, everybody's worried about AI just because, I mean, they're not sure whether it's going to really replace AI, like the radiologist or other medical field professionals. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a good question. I mean, if you look back at the field of radiology, right? Did computers replace radiology? Um, in some ways, it did. Or did CT replace radiologists or MRI? Those are technologies that like 40, 50 years ago were new. It's like, well, yes,
Right.
they did. Like in a way, like radiologists back then were just reading x-rays, right? They did x-rays and they were doing lots of angios for PE. Hmm. Those radiologists are now long gone. Um, they maybe did like 10 cases a day, like
Right, right,
that
right,
was all
right.
their work for the day. We had 10 x-rays is something that we might do in, you know, 20 minutes. Right.
Right, right,
But that
right,
that
right.
was so with technology, um, as technology evolves, we do much more. One radiologist now does what 100 radiologists used to do. And so in many ways, as AI evolves and gives us the ability to be more efficient for many things, you may be finding yourself doing 10 times as much volume of work as you did 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And we certainly see that. I mean, in 10 years, of practice for me, I've more than doubled my daily volume, maybe 3x compared to when I started. And it was a lot to start with. So I think I think that that's going to continue. We are, as radiologists, able to scale with technology. That's not always true in other fields of medicine. In a lot of fields of medicine, you can only see that one patient at a time. And so that's in a lot of ways why radiology is a pretty amazing field, is it shifts, can shift with new innovations and technology. I wouldn't be too worried about losing your job. I would be, it's more about the practice changing, and that make sure that the technologies we get actually are useful, and that we contribute to building them. Otherwise, they won't be useful.
Right, right. No, thank you so much. So one of the professor whom I was talking about, he said that AI would not replace radiologists, but exactly as you said, the radiologist who knows AI will replace the radiologist who doesn't know AI. So,
Just
yeah,
as a matter of time, I think that that's certainly true.
right, right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Albert. Thank you so much for your great in thoughts, your inputs, and your great lectures on this really kind of complex and dynamic and the hottest topic in currently, not just in radiology, not just in medical field, but throughout the world, which is artificial intelligence. Thank you so much for making time and providing this knowledge for us. Greatly appreciate your help.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah.
All right. Take
Right.
care.
Thank you. Just wanted to thank again the speaker, all the panelists in here, and especially wanted to thank all the attendees who attended this session. I'm pretty sure that you guys were completely blown by what Dr. Albert Shah said, um, and we hopefully we see great things done by AI in radiology fraternity in near future. Um, So I think we can go to the evaluation slide. I mean, there was no quiz in this session. Uh, as I was talking to Nat and Dr. Albert, I was saying that this topic is so beyond my comprehension too until Dr. Albert spoke about this. So it's hard for me to get a question on this too. It's so huge. So we have no quiz for this session, but this is the QR code to evaluate the session. Please evaluate the session. Only people who evaluate this would get a certificate upon completion of the evaluation. And our next session would be on October 20th, I guess. I'm sorry about the dates there. 2 Sundays from now at same time. The speaker is yet to be decided, but the session is going to be on imaging of thyroids and thyroid diseases. So please join us for our next session. You'll be receiving the email and the flyer soon. Thank you so much. Thanks all the panelists for joining this session. And thank you so much for attendance. And special thanks for the IT committee who worked always behind the screen and make this a grand success. Thank you so much. Nat, do you have anything to say?
No,
All right.
JP, no, the last session will be our last webinar of this year. And
Right.
then we will open for the registration for 2025 that are for new members. You here don't have to register because you're already in the system. Those are for new people. We'll send out the information soon.
Right. Right. So watch out for the information, watch out for your email for the next session, and also for the registration for next year, as Nat said, which is going to be starting soon. This would be for 2025. But again, wait for the email for our next session speaker and the moderator. Thank you so much.